We're the eyes and ears.
The common theme is preying upon someone's vulnerability.
Just think, if every one of us touched one person, it would make a significant impact on what's happening. Hey, it's Dr. Phil. You are on Fill in the Blanks, and my guest today is Kay Buck, Executive Director of the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, or CAST, C-A-S-T. Now, you're probably wondering, why are we talking about this? Well, I'm going to tell you why in just a minute, and you'll understand why Kay is here. She has over 16 years of experience in the violence against women field at the state, national, and international levels. As the executive, Kay leads the only organization in the entire country that is exclusively dedicated to working on the human rights issues of trafficking. Now, why is this relevant to you? Well, you're going to find out today, because we think of trafficking as some exotic international thing that happens in the shadows and people come in containers and all of that sort of thing. But the truth of the matter is, I'm going to bet that you have been within 5 or 6 feet of someone that is being trafficked within the last 48 hours of your life. Now, why do I say that? If you've gone to the grocery store, gone to a hotel, gone to a restaurant somewhere, there's a good chance that you have been close to or interacted with someone that's in a forced labor force. If you live in a rural area, you have probably driven past someone that has been hijacked in their life and forced into a labor force like slave labor. We're not just talking about prostitutes, sex workers that you see downtown hanging around seedy hotels. We're talking about people that are working in factories, restaurants, entertainment industry, hospitality industry, cleaning up hotel rooms, working events. This includes 50% of people that are forced labor, 50% of the people we're talking about are sex workers. It happens all over the country. Some are foreign nationals, a lot are domestic. So this doesn't just happen on TV or in big cities. I'll promise you, this is happening right around you, and we're going to talk about how you can spot them, what you should and shouldn't do, how you can help, how you can have an impact. Now, Kay oversees a dedicated team who compose 3 divisions: social services, legal services, and training and advocacy. And she's going to tell us all about CAST today and what we can do to identify and eliminate sexual and labor trafficking. So, Kay, welcome. What got you involved in all of this to begin with? Why this out of all the things you could be involved in?
Oh, wow. Well, at an early age, I felt strongly about women's rights, girls' rights, and have always kind of fought for the underdog. And so, let's see, I went to university and studied women's studies, and I was lucky enough to have this opportunity to move to Asia in the early 90s. And there I met up with a lot of non-governmental organizations working on human trafficking, and that is where I got the education of a lifetime. And when I moved to the United States, I continued that. And when CAST was ready to hire their first CEO, then they recruited me. At the time, I was doing some work in Sacramento.
Now, I guess I want to start bringing this down to the people, because we just finished our 20th season and 5 years before that on Oprah. So I would say I have a very devoted and committed group that's my audience, and they're action oriented. And so when I do something like this, I don't like to just talk about it in the sense of raising awareness, but instead translate to people about what they can do. And one of the things I was saying in the introduction is that all of us that are out in the world are the eyes and ears, and you're going to give us some ways to spot these survivors and some of the people that are caught up in this now. I've done a number of episodes about this over the years, and I've learned three things that I hold to be true, and I want you to refine those and teach me some more about them.
Sure.
One is that trafficking is not what most people think about it. Most people think about it in terms of what you see in movies with people being put in containers and shipped around. That does happen. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it's not always nearly as exotic as that. Number two, I don't know what the ratio is, but it's typically, I've found, more slave labor than sexual in nature, although that's more sensational and salacious, but it's more getting these people working for nothing and holding them kind of captive to that. Then third, it's happening all around us. We go to restaurants, we go to hotels, we go to events, and we're rubbing elbows with these people that you don't have to be interacting with prostitutes or drug dealers or whatever to be encountering these people in our lives, that they're in our lives, in our everyday world, particularly in major cities.
Right, and also in rural areas.
Yeah, certainly.
In the agricultural industry. Right.
Certainly if you're in farming areas and agricultural areas, we're less likely to interact with them there, but they're certainly represented there. Am I understanding the general topography of this thing?
That's right, exactly. I'm glad you said that, Dr. Phil, because you're right. I think we should not sensationalize this issue. It's bad enough as it is. And we've been around for almost 24 years, and almost every year, 50% of our cases are forced labor cases, 50% are sex trafficking cases. So as a community, it behooves us to really look at this holistically and not focus solely on sex trafficking like a lot of movies or TV shows do.
Okay, so how is this happening? Because I'll promise you, within 5 minutes, we're at Paramount Studios right now, which is in the middle of Hollywood. This is a very famous lot. We're just a few blocks off of Sunset here. We're at Melrose and Gower, right in the middle of Hollywood. I guarantee you we could go 5 minutes from here to Hollywood and Vine, to some of the areas where there are big restaurants, big hotels, and street corners, and find both forced labor and sex workers that are being trafficked by someone. Who are they and how did it happen?
Yeah, well, first of all, it can be anyone, right? So a lot of people think that it only happens in other countries, or foreign nationals are brought here. That certainly does happen a lot and make up a lot of our cases at CAST, but it's also domestic.
First off, is my premise correct? Could we go 5 minutes from here to these big hotels or the restaurants on Sunset in this area and find people that are forced labor at hotels, restaurants, theme parks, whatever around here?
Yeah, I can tell you last year, over 30% of our cases were in the hospitality industry. And those were all forced labor cases. It's also domestic servitude happening in very affluent areas 5 minutes from here. It's happening in restaurants and hotels and motels. So yes, that's why we need to educate ourselves that this is so much more than sex trafficking or what you would see on television. And what you asked before, what really puts people in those situations.
Who are they? Where'd they come from and how'd they get here?
Sometimes there are children who are, they're running away from home. They don't have a great home life, and recruiters or traffickers themselves can hone in on that and trick them into thinking that they love them or that they have a better opportunity for them. Foreign nationals, so people who are immigrants who are, again, tricked by foreign labor brokers in their hometown, in their country of origin, and they're tricked into thinking they have a great job here in the United States. Many times our clients don't even know that they are in Los Angeles. They just know that they're in the U.S. And, sometimes they are going to the supermarket with the trafficker and their family, or taking care of the trafficker's children in the case of domestic servitude. Sometimes they're working in a restaurant and they have to sleep and live and work all in the same place. So it's a lot of different scenarios, but the number one common theme is that they are exploited commercially. So they are exploited for profit. And what that means is one human being is exploiting another in order to make a profit.
That's exactly what I was wanting you to break down for me. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I'm wanting to go even more granular than that
Sure.
because I want people to understand. Let's talk about domestic. I'm going to talk about foreign nationals in a minute. I'm not saying they're any less important. Let's say some teenager in Idaho runs away because there's chaos in the home, there's
Mhm.
violence in the home, or there are rules they don't want to do. And I tell these runaways all the time, old sayings get to be old sayings because they're profound. And that old saying that the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence,
Mhm.
they'll think, I can be free out there. And so they run away. And I've talked to so many of them that have said, oh, I wish I could go back home.
Mhm.
That curfew doesn't seem like such a big issue now.
Right.
But they do run away. Maybe they hitchhike to LA or New York or Chicago or wherever. Let's say LA, since that's where we are. They get here and they're on the street. Maybe they have enough money for a night or two, but they're on the street. How do these traffickers spot them? How do they approach them? What do they say to them?
Oh, great question. So, well, first of all, I should say too, sometimes, kids might be part of the queer community. And so life at home is really difficult, right? So it's not always grass is greener. Sometimes they have to leave for a good reason. But what traffickers do, they'll either go in themselves or sometimes they use a recruiter, and they prey on people's vulnerability. So whether that be that they're trying to escape a bad situation at home or trying to move forward into a place of acceptance somewhere else in a new town or city, traffickers know how to spot vulnerability. That is the number one thing we see in all of our cases, Dr. Phil. And, what they say is, hey, I totally understand you. Let me help you. And it's either pretending to love them like a family member would, or they're saying, let me help you make some money. I know that that's what you need. So it takes on a lot of different scenarios in each case, but the common theme is preying upon someone's vulnerability.
All right. And you say they spot them.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about that, because if these recruiters or traffickers are hanging around some of these high traffic areas, you can tell, for example, watching whether somebody's walking with purpose from A to B or they have nowhere to
They're
go.
lost.
They're
Yes.
loitering, they're kind of walking without purpose, they're leaning against the building. They look hungry, they're dirty, they don't have anywhere to go, versus somebody that's on a mission. They're trying to get from their home to the library or to work or whatever. So they spot them, and that's the first cue. So they go up and say, hey, what's up? You hungry? You need something? Can I help you?
Mm-hmm.
They offer
help.
It's a pretty low bar, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that person has nowhere to go, nothing to eat, no money, no
Yep.
plan, no nothing. Almost anything is appealing.
Right. That's exactly right. I remember working with a young woman not that long ago, and she was she was a young woman and married and was in a domestic violence situation. So she was trying to escape that. And, she was on the streets of Santa Monica. She tried to go to the police several times. They did not listen to her and basically just said, go to this shelter. And there, the shelter also didn't recognize human trafficking. And so she never got the services that she really needed. It wasn't a proper intervention. And so she was, wandering the streets of Santa Monica, and this young man, swooped in, pretended that he cared about her, pretended that he loved her eventually, and he trafficked her. And so this is a common scenario that traffickers use in order to control the victims. They make them almost dependent on them.
So they'll spot this kid, might be a young man or young woman,
That's
teenager
right.
or
Yep.
whatever. They spot them there, start talking to them and find out what their vulnerabilities are, what their needs are, and they'll take them away from there and say, well, come with me. They might promise them a job, a place to sleep,
Stay. Yep.
drugs,
Food.
money, whatever. And given that they had nothing and nowhere to go, forming dependency happens really quick and really easy.
That's right.
Okay, so when you say trafficking is about one person exploiting another person for profit, there's nothing wrong with somebody being an agent for someone else and taking a percentage or what. If somebody said, hey, I can get you a job, that's how Hollywood works. There are agents and managers and all, but that's not what we're talking about
No,
here.
that is definitely not what we're talking about.
Totally different situation.
So there's something in the definition of trafficking called force, fraud, or coercion. So force is pretty straightforward, right? And fraud is what we were talking about earlier, where they're being tricked into thinking that life will be better if they go with the trafficker. And coercion takes on a lot of different, it can be done in a lot of ways. It might be threatening for foreign nationals, threatening to get them deported, or it might be like other types of threats that coerces them into going with the trafficker. So if you have force or fraud or coercion in these cases, that's what makes it human trafficking.
You say force, fraud,
coercion,
and the fraud can be love bombing them, gaslighting them, making promises,
tricking them.
Just tricking them.
Yeah.
Let's say they bring them home with them, put them to work, and don't provide for them at any reasonable level whatsoever. But they may also have 20 or 30 of these people in restaurants or hotels doing maid service, lawn service, all sorts of things.
Yeah, or events, like you said earlier.
Yeah.
We get that a lot, Dr. Phil, and it really struck me when you said that, because I remember talking to a young woman who was, she was trafficked into a home in a very ritzy area here in LA, and this family had a lot of events, and no one noticed that this woman was there all of the time and washing the dishes and cleaning up after the event until 5 a.m, starting again the next morning at 7 a.m. So there are signs, and you were correct in saying that probably most of us have interfaced with a victim of trafficking and just simply didn't know it because we didn't know what to look for.
And when there are big events, like my son's a musician, he just got back from like a 75 city tour where they did all amphitheaters, like 15 or 20,000 people. And there's tons of staff there, and they're all wearing, just says staff on it. And you look at some of these kids and they've all got a vacant stare. They look underfed. They're not well-groomed. They don't have things that kids their age would normally have. They're not whipping out smartphones.
Right.
They don't know each other. You just know that those kids are in a forced situation.
Right. So in there, I would look at how were they recruited? What kind of contract did they sign, if they have a contract even? So those are the types of things you'd want to look for in that particular industry. In a lot of our cases, people will be provided a contract, and then when they go to sign it, it's a completely different contract. But at that point, they feel like they already have to sign because they've made a verbal commitment. So there's a lot of things that we can look for as systems as well, right? It's not just a person-to-person thing. It is also looking at the systems that, like a recruitment system, that is exploiting these people. So events, you're right. Like as soon as you said a tour, my thought was looking at who's setting up for those tours, who's breaking all of it down, like kind of like the construction industry, because we've seen a lot of cases in construction as well, not just hospitality. So I think a lot of folks, because we aren't really covering this a lot enough in television and in the media about forced labor and how that can take place.
Hey, but what happens if, let's say you're at a restaurant and there's a busboy or girl over there that is, you can see them in the kitchen or they're bussing a table and your gut tells you
Something's off.
this isn't right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Listen to that.
Then you say something to that young person. They've been really schooled on what to say and how to answer the question. What do you say to those people?
Right. And they're most likely being watched and they know who's watching them, right? You might not know that, but they will know. And so they're probably not making direct eye contact. They probably don't want to answer your questions. It is important not to intervene. I want your listeners or your viewers to understand that.
You get them in a lot of trouble.
You could get them in trouble and make it worse for them. So, I remember many, many years ago, a colleague of mine, was at a restaurant and they simply went to the restroom and this was their favorite restaurant. And so they went to the restroom and they noticed that there was mattresses in the back in the kitchen, just kind of glanced out of the side of his eye. And that ended up being a human trafficking case. They were made to live there and work there. I've also handled cases at CAST where people who were trafficked domestically, so in a domestic servitude situation in a home, and that homeowner also owned a series of a chain of restaurants, and they were forced to work at the restaurant at night and in the home in the day. They were basically working 24/7 with very little sleep and no pay. So what you would say to people like that, let's say it is in a restaurant scenario, you would say, "Are you okay? Okay, I understand if you can't talk, but here's a hotline number." And I know your producer said that you would put our hotline number on there for people to have. That is really important. If they can have something that is discreet, that they can maybe have in their pocket, and they call when it's safe to do so. We always say something at CAST, and that is that victims or survivors, they are the most knowledgeable about how to stay safe, not anybody else. So it's really up to them to make that call. What we can do as a society, as a community, is make sure that we've got 24/7 care so that when that person is ready to call, it might be 2 a.m, but that someone who is trained and well-versed in getting people to safety is on the other side of that phone call.
Mm-hmm. We've talked to our viewers about this, and I've had emails back from people that have done exactly that. They've written down a hotline number, a safe house number, a place
That's right.
in their city
Yep.
where they can go and have just walked past the bus boy or the girl cleaning the table or whatever and just put it in their pocket or handed it to them
Mm-hmm.
and said, "Here's a number if you need it." Just kept walking, not drawn attention to it. And sure enough, it might be a few hours, it might be a month, but that person uses that phone number and calls, and sometimes until they get the opportunity or they get the courage.
That's right.
And, maybe who's watching them goes out of town or goes to sleep or
Yep.
whatever.
Goes out on an errand.
Yeah.
Yeah. What you're saying reminds me of a case. It was about 4 years ago here in LA. And it was someone from another country who was trafficked there, but brought here on vacation with the family that was trafficking them. And they were staying in a very ritzy hotel, and no one would have suspected that. But the family went away that day. They had their children with them, and they went to an amusement park. And at that time, and I should back up, we have systems in place and laws in place in the U.S. that CAST and all of our partners have collaborated on so that when people are getting visas in their home country or in the country where they're from, they are kind of separated from the family or the employer and given the hotline information or given information if there is any trouble. This woman, this young woman, held that card it was actually in her bra strap for weeks until she had the courage to call our hotline number. So my staff, we have an emergency response team, and they jumped into action. They figured out which hotel that she was in, and they waited down the street, and they waited and they waited. And that girl, the young lady did not show up, but she called the hotline later that night and said she didn't have the courage to leave. She was afraid that the traffickers would come back to the hotel. But the next day, she actually did leave, and we were able to take her from that place and take her to our shelter. And so now, because of that, she's free today and, living her life. So you're right in saying that it's about an opportunity to escape, but it's also the courage.
They also need to know, maybe they're listening to this or a friend of theirs is listening to this right now. They need to know when they do make the call, they're not going to be pressured to do something they don't want to do
Never.
or they're not ready to do. I don't want anyone that's caught in this situation right now to think, oh man, when I make that call, I'm in it now. That's not true. What's going to happen is when they call that hotline number that's going to be on drphil.com, it's going to be on the podcast site. It's going to be on my Facebook page. It's going to be tweeted. It's going to be everywhere. When they make that call, the person on the other end is going to listen. They're going to answer questions. They're going to let them know what their options are. They're not going to get them in trouble.
Exactly. They're trained counselors and advocates, right? So it's not an arm of law enforcement. A lot of our clients, a lot of survivors are afraid to call a hotline because they think that it's law enforcement or government. And they're, for good reason, right? They have not had good experiences with law enforcement, which we can talk about in a little bit, how this issue of forced criminality is so huge in the issue of human trafficking. So it's important that they know this is a nonprofit organization. It is trained counselors and advocates who are there to listen and help them devise a plan that's comfortable for them, right? So a lot of what we do is safety planning on that hotline. And if someone's not ready to leave right there and then, that's okay. No one's going to force them to do that because they're in charge of their own safety. And we're kind of like a partner in helping them figure out a plan to escape.
Yeah. And there is a science to this. That's what I want people to know. This isn't something where you just got a bunch of busybodies that are getting in there meaning well, but not knowing what they're doing. If you jumped in here in the middle, I'm talking to Kay Buck, the CEO of CAST. And by the way, she was awarded the Presidential Award for extraordinary efforts to combat trafficking in persons in 2014. She's been doing this for 16 years. And she got the award for championing a survivor-centered approach to combating human trafficking. This is something that I just keep making the point. It's around all of us. It's in the agricultural field. It's in the hospitality industry. You see it in hotels, restaurants. It goes on in forced labor. It also goes on in the sex worker industry, and we haven't talked about that yet, but we will. But when these people get a job, let's say they're working in a restaurant, is this something that traffickers will have a company and they will provide these people and the company gets paid so the money doesn't go through the individual's hand? How do they usually structure this?
Sometimes traffickers will directly recruit themselves, will recruit victims themselves. Sometimes they will use an intermediary, like a foreign labor broker or some type of recruitment agency. So that is why having regulations for the recruitment industry is so important. A few years ago here in California, we learned from our cases, so directly from survivors telling us how they were recruited. And we realized that there were some holes legislatively. And so we worked with survivors. It was this beautiful coming together, a partnership of survivors and activists and legislators to fill that gap. And so now foreign labor brokers have to register for in the state of California. And with that regulation, and also one important thing is that the workers should never pay a fee to work. The people paying the fee should be the employer, clearly. But what was happening, what we learned from our cases, is that the recruiters were also charging a fee for workers. So essentially, they were also in debt bondage, even though they were free, right? Once they escaped, they still had $12,000. I remember one case, it was $35,000 per person, per worker, charged. Some of them, took out loans. I remember one case, it was so awful, where the victim took out a loan from a loan shark in their small community back home. And so the loan shark, when they didn't get paid, went after the victim's children in their home country. So that's why we need to care about not just the person-to-person interventions, but the systems that are allowing human trafficking to flourish, to happen.
Okay, so let's say there's a Acme Hotel. I'm just going to make up a name because I don't want to impugn anyone, but let's say there's an Acme Hotel that's got 1,000 rooms, and they have 200 trafficked forced labor people working in their laundry or cleaning their rooms or whatever. Are they guilty, or are they turning a blind eye, which is also guilty? Are they complicit in this? What's their role in this?
Yeah, well, they should know. So the hospitality industry, hotels or airlines, I believe they have the responsibility to make sure that all of their employees, especially management, is trained. They should be looking at the contracts and know who they're hiring, even if it's through an intermediary, right? That's important. And beyond that, they should also follow, at least in California, we have legislation where they are required to actually post our 24-hour hotline and the national hotline in the place of business, so that if trafficking is occurring either in their own workforce or as visitors to that hotel, that survivors or victims have a place to call. They have a resource where they can call for help, and it's a 24-hour hotline run by nonprofit organizations so that they can plan for an escape safely. So to answer your question, I think everyone has a role to play. I definitely think small businesses, corporations, everyone should really educate themselves and their management on what human trafficking is, so that we can create, safer communities. We can create places of work where workers can be happy and be well. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yes, I believe everyone has a role to play.
It's their job to know.
It's their job to know. Absolutely.
I mean, that's the point. They may not be trafficking these people. They might be paying minimum wage. They say, we got them from Housekeepers or Us, and we're paying minimum wage. How are we supposed to know that it's not going to the employee? Well, it's their job to know.
It's their job to know, right? And you can look at contracts, and one thing we see is that contracts are often in English for workers that they are recruiting from other countries. Clearly, that's not okay, right? Like, if you're going to hire someone, make sure that they understand it in their native language. So there's a lot of things there's a whole slew of things, Dr. Phil, that companies can look to either vet their supply chains. It's important to bring in experts that are third-party auditors in order to help you prevent or at least decrease the chance of human trafficking happening in your supply chain as a company, or also in your place of business like a hotel.
Now, without getting into the politics of illegal immigrants and borders and what should or should not be happening, we have a lot of people coming in through the southern border right now. what percentage of those individuals are getting swept up into this trafficking? Do we have any idea?
Yeah, it'd be great if we did know. We don't have any type of prevalence study on that, but what I can tell you is that, and it's very relevant to what's happening today in the Ukraine, where when we see countries that are have armed conflict or war, there is an increase in people becoming more vulnerable to traffickers or the recruiters that swoop in and pretend to help them. So, and it's not just the Ukraine, right? We get cases from the Philippines, from Ethiopia, from Afghanistan. So this is very relevant to world events happening today. And what we should remember always is that when there's armed conflict or when there is a natural disaster that forces people to leave their homes, they are at risk for human trafficking. And we see that right here in our cases in Los Angeles.
I work a lot with law enforcement, varies sometimes on a case-by-case basis, sometimes fraud investigators with the FBI and a number of states. And we were talking about the various scams and frauds that are perpetrated. We had a meeting up in Central California. The whole idea was that every scam is based on some vulnerability of the target, whether it's the elderly that are scared that they're going to run afoul of the government, whether it's an IRS scam or an insurance scam or whatever. With some populations, it's the FOMO, the fear of missing out. We got to get this or we're going to miss an opportunity or we're going to be in trouble some way. But it's all about finding someone that's in a vulnerable state and preying upon that at the time. We talked about events, and I was talking to some of the law enforcement people when we were talking about the sexual side of this. So we're talking about when you have something like the NBA All-Star Game or the Super Bowl, that the traffickers run amok at that point, that the number of prostitutes in a town where a Super Bowl is occurring goes up 10, 20-fold in a matter of a weekend. Just
Yeah.
bang.
I'm really glad you brought this up, Dr. Phil. So as activists and advocates on human trafficking, we are actually concerned about, again, the setup and the takedown of those large events. There's no study that shows that human trafficking increases during large sporting events, whether it be the World Cup or the Super Bowl. But what we say is it wouldn't really make good business sense for traffickers to just focus on one day or a couple of days. We should be doing the outreach every day of the year, right? And it's not usually centered around the Super Bowl. So the Super Bowl just happened close to home here, right, in Inglewood. Our numbers actually went down on our hotline during that time. And in talking with other partners, other non-governmental organizations in other cities where the Super Bowl has been, they've had the same type of data, right? So I don't think that it's necessarily increasing. That the sex industry isn't increasing during the Super Bowl, but what we should be looking at is who's setting up and the hospitality industry that is flourishing during that time as well, because those are the cases we can be looking at. If we're only looking at sex trafficking as it relates to large sporting events, we're missing all of the forced labor that might be happening in those cases too.
Well, it's not either or, though.
It's both, exactly. It's both.
The forced labor, I started talking about that because I think it is probably the least talked about, but I think the most prolific and certainly the most hidden and insidious that we have to be aware of. But sex trafficking is a reality.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
that does occur.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why the outreach has to happen every day of the year, right? So we're 24 years old as an organization, and every year more than 50% of our cases are sex trafficking cases. And it tends to happen to, again, people who are vulnerable, and it's both girls and boys, women, men, people representing the queer community. So many people are vulnerable to the tricks that traffickers are using to force them into the commercial sex industry.
Whether it's sex trafficking or forced labor, when you transition these people out, how much does violence and intimidation play a role in these people's control?
Intimidation is huge, right? We don't see as much violence in cases that I think most people think. We definitely have very violent cases, don't get me wrong. That indeed does happen, and that's very serious when that happens. But the majority of our cases, we see threats of violence and intimidation, and that's what keeps people, victims, in line, or what the traffickers do to control them. So a common thing might be, in fact, I remember a case not that long ago. It was a young woman. She was 16 years old. She was raised by her grandmother. And the traffickers used threats of violence towards the grandmother, saying, look, we know because we recruited you, so we know where you live. We know where your grandma lives. We know where she shops. And we're going to kill your grandmother if you don't do as we say, which was engage in sex trafficking. So that's usually how it works, where traffickers are intimidating them and making threats so that, victims feel like they have no choice but to comply. What, 16-year-old who loves their grandmother more than anything else in the world, of course she's going to comply. And that's how they keep people controlled.
I've had these survivors tell me, whether they've been out for a month or 10 years, that the reason they didn't get beat up, the reason they didn't get acid thrown on them, the reason they didn't get stabbed or shot or whatever, as opposed to being threatened or having their families threatened, is because they said they can't make money if we're hurt. They can't make money if we can't work. So they threaten rather than do it, because
right.
If they break our arm, we can't change sheets.
That's exactly it. How am I going to make money if someone's hurt or injured, right?
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. We do see some injuries, of course, but I would say most of our cases are threats, threats of violence. Yeah.
Now, these people that are caught up in this, that are trafficked, everything is neglected. They don't have any health care. Nothing is prioritized for them in terms of being taken care of. Only what is necessary to keep them on the job, right? What condition do you find these people in when you do get them out?
I'm going to tell you about a case that really made an impact on me, where the woman, it was a domestic servitude case. So the woman was forced to sleep and basically live in the hallway, wasn't even given a bedroom. The dogs in the house slept on the bed, and she was sleeping in the dog bed when we found her. She was, malnourished. She was barely given any food. She was, given maybe some rice every day. She was experiencing short-term memory loss, health issues because of all of that, not to mention the mental health issues, right? So that's why it's important for organizations like CAST to have what we call holistic or comprehensive care. When people come to us, they're physically ill, their mental health is not good, they're afraid for their lives, they're afraid for their families. So it's really important that we have clinicians on staff. It's also important that we have attorneys and social workers, each person kind of playing a role in that survivor's life. So we haven't talked about this yet, Dr. Phil, but it's the one crime victim population that is constantly criminalized for being trafficked. It's ridiculous how our system treats victims of trafficking. We did a study of survivors of trafficking. Over 90% had rap sheets, had records of arrest for crimes that traffickers were forcing them to commit. And so for this reason, having an attorney or a whole legal team support survivors of trafficking is important for, doing the vacatur of records so that they can apply for housing without any problem, so that they can apply for jobs and truly get back on their feet again once they've escaped. So it's an issue of intervening and making sure we're helping people escape from the traffickers, but it's also important for us to fix the systems that are re-exploiting victims over and over again.
Okay, so somebody is forced into sex trafficking, for example. They get busted for prostitution.
Yeah. And other things too, like assault and theft. We see so many, not just prostitution-related crimes, but a lot of different crimes where they're arrested because the trafficker's putting them in that situation.
What other kinds of crimes?
So like assault, theft in order to eat, drugs, selling drugs. There's a lot of different crimes that we see. But the most important thing to understand, and for law enforcement to be trained this way, is that the traffickers are threatening to kill them or to kill their family member or to beat them or not feed them if they don't comply. So as a system, we need to do a better job to look at those nuances so that victims aren't re-exploited by systems that are designed to actually help them.
So they might tell them, you need to go in and shoplift some high-value item for me, or you're not going to get fed today, or you're going to sleep out in the cold, or you're going to get beat,
That's
or
right.
I'm going to beat up your sister or whatever. And then if they get caught doing that, then they get charged. And so now you get them out and they go apply for a legitimate job and they go, well, you got an arrest record. I'm not going to hire you.
Exactly. And which is why having legal services in addition to clinical services and health services is so important for survivors of trafficking. We did a study with survivors and we learned that of the top 3 services that were available, legal services was one of the top ones they needed, right? So even survivors are telling us that we need attorneys to help us vacate these records because we can't even lease an apartment in our own name. So who do you think is on the lease? The trafficker, right?
Yeah.
They're again forcing them to be dependent on someone who doesn't have their best interest at heart.
Now, I know at least in California, you've worked with the DA's organization.
Yeah, all of law enforcement and the DAs, we have a
DAs
partnership
are
with.
really important.
Right. They're really important, as is the Attorney General of California as well, also a big supporter of our cause. So it's the child welfare system too. We are working actively with LA County right now to pilot this new program so that all of the county agencies, all of the systems that might unintentionally re-exploit or re-traumatize victims of trafficking no longer do so by having training and a fuller understanding of exactly how human trafficking works.
Yeah, and the point is that if you're re-victimizing this person, creating additional vulnerability, which makes them susceptible to being exploited again.
Exactly, yes.
Because you're putting them back on the street again. They can't get a job. They can't get an apartment. So now they're standing there aimless again and subject to being picked off again.
Exactly, at least where maybe I'll get a meal, right?
Yeah.
That's what they're thinking, right?
So this is an auto-exacerbating circumstance if the system continues to re-victimize them.
That's right, exactly.
What we're trying to do is break the cycle.
Yes.
But there's got to be more to it because this is how they've learned to get by. It was forced on them, but it is their default mode. So you've also got to empower them with education, housing, skills, something where they don't have to go back to this. They've
That's right.
learned some accounting skills, some retail skills, some inventory
and life skills,
Exactly.
Right? How to negotiate, how to be confident and have a sense of self-worth. That's why the programs at CAST are so important, right? I hear over and over again survivors who graduate from our program that's what they appreciate most. It is the hard services like legal services and housing, shelter, but it's also that sense of self-esteem that they never had before. So, for example, remember the survivor I mentioned earlier from Santa Monica, where she was on the streets of Santa Monica? That's where she was recruited. She unfortunately didn't get a proper intervention by law enforcement or even a homeless shelter where she went. But when she did get the help, when she came to CAST and got the help that she needed, we, got her in line with one of our corporate partners, Paul Mitchell Schools. And she got a scholarship to go through that program. And she's now a successful business owner. But now she needs business training. So we're setting her up with another community partner to learn, how to set up a website, how to do marketing on social media for her business. Those are the types of things. That community of support around a survivor is what will keep them in a place of self-confidence, self-agency, self-determination, and be successful in their life.
I don't want to get too far off the mark here, but that's something that if we were teaching this in the schools, we're teaching kids to add, subtract, geography, a little history. If we were also teaching them to recognize signs of anxiety, depression, erosion of self-esteem, things of that nature, then you know what? They might not wind up in the situation of being so vulnerable to be trafficked to begin with.
Exactly.
And the fact that you're doing it when you're doing it might be the first time they've ever had anybody teach them about self-worth, self-esteem, whatever, because we're not teaching that. We're not teaching those mental health skills. We're not teaching them to recognize the signs of low self-worth, low self-esteem, the red flags for depression, anxiety, loneliness, learned helplessness, which is so important because when you get in the situation they're in, they truly get a perceptual set that says there's nothing I can do about this.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I would say also looking at like social networks, right? It's important for everyone and especially children to have a community of support around them, right? So what we know is traffickers will target people who are essentially alone, right? So making sure in the schools and also as parents, right, that we should be looking at do all of the children have a healthy social network and the skills to have that?
I've talked to some of these sex trafficked individuals that have been found, pulled out. I won't call this particular one a survivor because she claimed when I talked to her in 2017 that she was sold by her parents at birth to a powerful international sex trafficker, and she wasn't locked in a cage, but she was flown all over the world. And when she got old enough, then she was sex trafficked and eventually got out. I talked to her a matter of months after she was out. And when I talked to her, I heard in her voice, could see in her face and her eyes, she wanted to go back because she felt judged, unaccepted, shame and guilt for what she had done and the way people looked at her. And she felt safer and more, I guess, in her element back there than she did in the outside world because she didn't get the kind of programs that CAST offers.
That's exactly, you hit the nail on the head. So as a community, service providers, government agencies, and just communities need to listen to what survivors are telling us, right? That's the first step. If we're just setting up services and not talking with survivors about what their needs are, and then also evaluating after they go through our program or during the program, we should be evaluating if what we're doing is working. Because when we create these programs in partnership with survivors, truly listening to them, that's when we don't have survivors wanting to go back to traffickers because they finally have found their community, right? So absolutely, it is a lot about developing programs, but it's also developing communities so that people feel safe there. They don't feel judged. They don't feel like the community has let them down. So, if a survivor of trafficking goes to, let's say, a homeless shelter and, you know, they're not treated well, or they feel like they've been judged because they were sex trafficked or trafficked in general, then they won't feel comfortable there. We have to create a community where there's a sense of justice and belonging for all survivors.
Our number one need is acceptance. Our number one fear is rejection.
Mm-hmm.
And if you
True.
come out with shame and guilt and you're rejected by those that sit in judgment of you, you are going to go back. We've seen it a million times with kids that are sexually assaulted as children. They objectify themselves. They think this is what I have to offer, and they invariably become promiscuous because they think this is what I have to offer. This is what gets me attention. If somebody doesn't intervene and do what they have to do to heal those wounds. That's why it's so important what CAST is doing.
Oh, thanks for that. And yeah, what we do, it's survivor-centered care, but it's trauma-informed, right? So we're every single thing we do, even our legal program, is trained on trauma, right? So you've got basically attorneys who aren't social workers, but they have enough knowledge about trauma in order to serve someone without judgment. That is the key.
How many people worldwide do you think are caught up in trafficking?
Yeah, I'm asked that a lot. The reality is there aren't credible studies that really tell us that. What we know is that it is a growing human rights violation, especially when you have war in countries or broken child welfare systems here. Trafficking does increase. I can tell you that at CAST, and we serve, the whole of Los Angeles County, our numbers have steadily been increasing over the last 24 years. So last year alone, we saw nearly 2,000 survivors and their family members, whereas, even 12 years ago, that number was only in the hundreds. So we know that it's always happened. Human trafficking has always happened, and there is increasing awareness, and we're seeing more and more cases come to light, so we're able to help them. But we don't have a really good prevalence study.
Is it millions worldwide?
I do think it's millions, but I can't say credibly. I can't cite a credible study that is really done scientifically. But even if it's Dr. Phil, even if it's, I don't know, 100,000, let's say, that's not any study. I'm not citing that, but even that, like this is totally preventable. This is one human being exploiting another one for profit. We can prevent this from happening.
But we know there are credible studies that say 1 in 4 women will be subjected to some kind of physical violence in their lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that is hugely underreported.
Right. And so is human trafficking as
So-
an issue. Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that the logic of that is absolutely correct. And I do also think that government needs to put the resources together to have a prevalence study.
Well, when you look at agricultural workers worldwide
Mm-hmm.
and forced labor, I just can't imagine that the numbers aren't staggering. I'm not going to try to guess at a number, but it's enough of a problem. And there are two things, and I'm keeping you too long, but there are two things that I want to talk about before we finish.
Sure.
And one is I have an advisory board at Dr. Phil that's made up of the top minds in psychiatry,
Mhm.
psychology,
Mhm.
medicine, sociology, nursing, all the different disciplines, and they're from the top learning centers around the country, Harvard, Yale, University of Texas.
That's great.
One of my advisory board members is Dr. Charles Sophie. He's retired from now, but he was the medical director of the Department of Child and Family Services here in LA, which is the largest agency of its kind in the country. He and I have talked to young kids that are runaways on the streets that we'd see sometimes under a bridge, and they would be on a freeway up under an overpass, and ask them, why are you not at a shelter? There's a shelter not 7 blocks from here. And I remember one of them telling me, and it was the phrase that he used, and the girl that was with him nodded when he said it, is, we don't want to run the gauntlet. And I said, the gauntlet? And he said, that shelter you're talking about is at the end of it's not a through street. It's at the end, it's like 3 blocks. The last couple of blocks leading up to the shelter is what we call the gauntlet, because it's lined on both sides with drug dealers and pimps and traffickers.
Right.
And to get there, you got to walk past all of them. And they've got money and drugs and clothes and cars and options. And it's just a temptation that we just don't want to deal with. We'd rather sleep under the bridge.
So that's exactly what we were talking about earlier, where they are the experts in their own safety, right? And as helping professionals, or what we call allies, right? We're allies to survivors. Our job is to listen to that, because they do know best. We can bring in technical skills and resources and support to wrap around them, but that's the key. So, in that case, the helping professional, let's say it's the social workers, would be important to find another more suitable housing solution that is not in that area that they're so afraid of. Listen to them and find alternatives. I think as a community, we can do a much better job listening to the people we are supposed to be supporting and helping, and design solutions that are based on the expertise that they're telling us. And we simply don't do enough of that, I think, across the board. And it's one thing CAS does. You mentioned you have an advisory board. We also have an advisory board of survivors who've gone through programs and they've healed from the trauma. They are perfect experts to be telling us how we should shape our programs now and into the future.
Yeah. I just thought that was chilling when they said that.
Yeah, it is chilling.
The other thing that we haven't talked about, there's a lot we haven't talked about. We could go on forever. You were discreet, but you mentioned there are some very nice neighborhoods in LA. I live in one of them, where people have parties and events and have people working till 5 a.m. and then back up at 7 a.m. And what does this say about those people? Because they know what they're doing. They know that these young people, or maybe not young people anymore, are being treated inhumanely, that they're sleeping on a dog bed, that they're eating whatever is getting ready to be thrown away, that
right, expired food.
They're being sleep deprived and overworked and malnourished and underpaid, if paid at all. But yet they just go get in their Mercedes and go get their next appointment.
We find that they tend to dehumanize people, right, to benefit what they're doing, or to justify what they're doing. And it's still wrong. And I think that's why, as a community, we need to hold people accountable to be good to others, to make sure that any worker is paid fairly and treated well. We simply need to care more for other human beings, our fellow human beings. And, I know that that's a much broader thing than running an anti-trafficking organization, but it makes sense, doesn't it? That if we're carrying that message, if we are raising awareness about equity issues, right? And about fairness and love for your neighbor, all of that really intersects with the prevention of human trafficking.
Yeah, I actually heard a woman talking a few years ago. She was at a restaurant in a booth. You couldn't see, but you could
Yeah.
hear over the booth. She was talking about her help from some Central American country, not Mexico. She might have been paying her a fabulous salary, I don't know. But she was telling her friend that they had a dirt floor in their home.
Mm.
So trust me, she says, anything is fabulously better than what she had. And I could tell from what she was saying that she was justifying what she was doing. It doesn't matter that she used to have a dirt floor. She's on your watch now, lady.
Mhm.
And Robin's saying, just sit down. Just, you don't know the whole story. And as she talks some more, I'm saying, Robin, sit down.
Mhm. Mhm.
The lady left and we got the license number and
Mhm.
turned
Yeah.
it into DCFS to do a home visit. It is a matter of dehumanizing.
It is. And I think also it's important that we model humanizing,
Yeah.
right? So the more we do that, if, when we're at restaurants, to be really respectful to all of the workers, to ask how they're doing, I think the more that we can live our lives and model it for other people, the better, right?
Yeah.
It's doing our part, right? So your viewers might not be, and they should not, intervene in human trafficking situations, right? Leave that to people who are trained. But put the hotline number in their phones and always have that ready, and treat people with kindness and humanity.
Yeah, slip that hotline number discreetly to someone can make a difference. Well, last question.
Mhm.
What do y'all need?
Oh, that's a great question. So I will say that the pandemic hit survivors of trafficking really hard. So our existing clients, most of them, I think over half of them, lost their jobs. So we needed to do direct assistance for rental assistance, basic necessities, healthcare, everything. And we spent over 400% more in direct care with our clients during that time. In addition, our hotline cases, so our emergency response program, increased by 88%. So really what we need are resources. We need the community to rally around us. I mean, survivors are not going to be okay like many people are as we're getting out of this pandemic era, whatever that's going to mean in the future. So service providers really need the resources in order to do our work. Most people stay with us about a year and a half in our shelters or in our service programs. And that's what's really needed. We need the resources to carry out this surge in urgent cases.
What kind of donation makes a difference?
Well, any donation makes a difference. So, of course, cash donations are preferred so that we can use it in an emergency because we see so many emergencies every minute of the day. But, if someone can give $20 and that's what is significant to them, that is awesome. If someone can give $1 million, that is awesome because we need that as well, given the increase in cases and care that we're
What's
delivering.
the budget for a shelter?
So our entire budget is $10 million to operate all of our programs each year.
Mm-hmm.
And for one of our shelters, it's about, anywhere from $800,000 to $1 million per year serving just that one shelter.
Mm-hmm.
So housing is costly, all right? Because it's wraparound care, food and training, vocational training. It's not just a roof over someone's head. It's that comprehensive care and building of self-esteem that happens under that roof.
All right, I've got millions of viewers, and seriously, if people make whatever donation they can, then in the aggregate, it can make a difference. It can keep a shelter going for a month. It can add the ability to provide wardrobe for people to go to job interviews. It can provide food. It can do anything. So anything that people can contribute in the aggregate can make a difference.
It absolutely makes a difference.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
It's a community coming together
Well,
and
I'm going to have a
supporting.
button on
That's
there
great.
so
Thank
people can
you.
click and do what they need to do, and I'll be clicking it, and I'm going to ask them to join me to do it. You've done a great job of defining this for people because I wanted to bring it down to their day-to-day walk
That's
so they
important. Yeah.
understand
Yeah.
that this isn't something that happens in somebody else's town, in somebody else's city, in some
Right.
other country,
Yep.
at some other strata of the society.
Yeah.
All of us interact with this in some way if we'll just open our eyes and recognize the warning signs, recognize the profile
Mm-hmm.
of that kid. And I want to underline the point you said, don't intervene. Slip them a number to call a professional, because if you intervene, you could get the hell beat out of that person that night.
Mm-hmm.
But what are you doing talking to this person? You trying to make trouble? You
Yep.
trying to get me in trouble? You don't want to do that. You just want to slip them a number or whatever. And don't go talk to the manager. The manager might be involved. Just
Correct.
slip the number
Yep.
to the person as you walk by or something, and maybe they'll use it, maybe they won't.
Right. And
And
eventually, and it might take time, right?
Yeah.
So you said earlier that it might take a month or months for people to make that call. But that's the important point, that they are empowering themselves to make that call,
Yeah.
right? And that's important. It means they're ready to
But
make
we're
the
the
call.
eyes and ears.
That's right.
I mean, there's millions of us. Just think, if every one of us touched one person that's in forced labor, whether it be prostitution or cleaning up somewhere or whatever, and 10% of them used the number, it would make a significant impact on what's happening.
Exactly.
Thank you for talking to me.
Thank you, Dr. Phil. Thank you so much.
All right, I appreciate it. All right, guys, look on the website. I'm going to have lots of information on there. We're going to list some resources for CAST. We're going to have a list of warning signs, things that you can do, all the things that you need to know to have an impact. This is a way to help people less fortunate than yourself. So put it on your list of things to do. It is certainly on mine. We'll see you next time.